The Amityville Horror is more than just the tale of a haunted house. It's a disturbing, spine-chilling story that has captured the public's imagination for decades. It's not merely a series of strange occurrences or ghostly manifestations. It's a tale of evil, of darkness, of an ancient malevolent force that preys on the souls of those who dare to enter its grasp. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, became infamous not just for the brutal murders that occurred within its walls, but for the terrifying experiences of the Lutz family, who moved into the house in 1975, only to find themselves terrorized by something far worse than mere spirits. But the real horror of this case begins long before the Lutz family ever stepped foot in the house. In fact, it begins with a tragedy so horrific, it stained the house with blood that would never wash away. In 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr., a troubled young man, murdered 6 members of his family in cold blood. In the dead of night, DeFeo went from room to room, shooting each of his relatives while they slept. His parents, 2 brothers and 2 sisters were all murdered in their beds with a .35 caliber rifle. The brutal killings shocked the quiet suburban town of Amityville, New York, and instantly cast a dark shadow over 112 Ocean Avenue. DeFeo's trial would send ripples through the nation. He was eventually convicted of second-degree murder, but his defense was bizarre and disturbing. Ronald DeFeo claimed that he was driven to kill by voices that spoke to him from the walls of the house. He said the voices compelled him to murder his family. Whether this was a true account of what happened or simply a fabrication designed to avoid a harsher sentence, no one can say for sure. But one thing was certain. Something dark and evil had taken root in that house, something that was waiting for the right moment to strike again. The story doesn't end with DeFeo's conviction. The house, now soaked in blood and tragedy, would sit empty for over a year before another family would move in, the Lutz family. In December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, Daniel, Missy, and Christopher, were looking for a fresh start. They found what they believed to be the perfect home at 112 Ocean Avenue, a large, picturesque Dutch colonial with a view of the nearby canal. Despite the house's bloody history, the Lutz family was drawn to the property. The price was right, and they felt it was a place where they could escape their busy lives and build a future. But they could not have known that they were about to step into a nightmare. The strange occurrences began almost immediately. The first night, George and Kathy noticed an unsettling stillness in the house. The silence was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The next day, things started to get worse. The temperature in the house would fluctuate, dipping suddenly to freezing cold, even though the weather outside was mild. The Lutzes would feel a sense of unease whenever they walked through certain rooms, a feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of their perception. Kathy was the first to experience something more overt. She began noticing strange smells. The distinct odor of rotting flesh or something sulfurous would waft through the house, no matter how many times she cleaned. She assumed it was just an old house problem, perhaps plumbing issues or decay, but it was far worse. The smell felt unnatural, almost malevolent, and no amount of scrubbing or airing out could get rid of it. It was as if the house itself was exuding a kind of sickness, something unclean and festering deep within its walls. But the strangest occurrences came after their children began experiencing things that no child should ever have to experience. Missy, the Lutz's young daughter, began talking about an imaginary friend named Jody. At first, Kathy dismissed it as just a phase, a child's playful imagination running wild. But as the days passed, Missy's behavior grew more concerning. She began to speak of Jody in ways that made Kathy uneasy. Missy described Jody as a little girl, but there was something off about her. She had glowing red eyes. The more Missy spoke about Jody, the more Kathy began to worry. Missy would often speak to Jody for hours on end, as though having a deep conversation. But the oddest part? Jody wasn't always described as a little girl. At times, Missy would refer to her as a creature, a being that was much more sinister, much darker than any ordinary imaginary friend. Kathy had hoped it was just a phase, but she could feel something was wrong. One night, she heard Missy talking to Jody in the living room. When Kathy approached, she found Missy talking to thin air, her eyes wide and vacant, as though she was in a trance. Missy looked up at Kathy with a strange expression on her face, her eyes cold and emotionless. She calmly told Kathy that Jody didn't want them to leave the house. And then Missy said something that would haunt Kathy forever. Jody said it's better for us if we stay. It wasn't just Missy's behavior that raised alarm. George, too, began to change. He became obsessed with the house. He would wake up every night at 3:15 a.m., the same time that the DeFeo murders had occurred. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. But soon, he began to associate the hour with an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something dark and evil was lurking, waiting for him to slip into the shadows. George began to feel drawn to the house's basement, a place that seemed to radiate an overwhelming, suffocating energy. It was as though the house itself was trying to pull him deeper into its grip. As days turned into weeks, the activity intensified. The Lutzes started to notice that things in the house were moving on their own. Doors would slam shut with a force that rattled the walls. Windows would open and close of their own accord. The air would grow thick and cold, so much so that they could see their breath inside the house. despite the warmth of the heating system. And then there were the voices. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, low and guttural, echoing through the hallways, making the air feel thick with malice. The most disturbing moment came one night when Kathy woke up to find that her body was covered in scratches, deep and bloody, as if something had clawed at her in her sleep. She had no memory of the event, but the wounds were undeniable. It was as if some invisible force was attacking them, trying to destroy them piece by piece, and each time they thought they could escape, the house would drag them back into its nightmare. At their wits' end, the Lutzes reached out to the famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens, well known for their work on high-profile cases like the haunting of the Perron family, had seen their fair share of strange occurrences. But when they arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue, they were confronted with something far darker than they had ever encountered before. From the moment they stepped into the house, Ed and Lorraine were immediately struck by the intensity of the malevolent energy that seemed to saturate the very air. Ed, a demonologist, felt an overwhelming sense of evil, a power so strong that it seemed to pull at his very soul. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, sensed the presence of something dark and ancient that had taken root in the house long before the Lutzes had arrived. The Warrens began their investigation by interviewing the Lutz family and conducting a walkthrough of the house. As they moved from room to room, Lorraine's psychic abilities began to pick up on disturbing sensations. She could feel a cold presence lingering in the shadows, something watching them, something waiting for the right moment to strike. But it was not just ghosts they were dealing with. Lorraine soon realized that the house was not simply haunted. It was possessed by a demonic force. Something ancient and terrifying was using the house as a vessel to exert its power over the living. During their investigation, the Warrens set up cameras and other recording equipment in an attempt to capture evidence of the paranormal activity. It wasn't long before they began to experience the supernatural firsthand. Strange phenomena continued to escalate. Rooms would grow colder, even when the furnace was running. Objects would shift on their own, and strange, unexplainable noises filled the house. One of the most famous pieces of evidence came in the form of a photograph. Taken during a night investigation, it showed a shadowy figure standing in a doorway. A figure that wasn't visible to the naked eye. The figure had glowing eyes, and it seemed to be watching the investigators as they moved through the house. Lorraine felt an overwhelming presence in that area, and when the photograph was developed, the figure was clearly visible. No one had seen it in real time. It was a clear indication that something malevolent was actively manifesting in the house. In addition to this, Ed himself was physically attacked. While conducting an investigation in the basement, he was suddenly shoved violently against a wall. The impact was so intense that it left him shaken and bruised. It was clear that whatever entity resided in the house was not merely haunting the space. It was actively trying to harm the living. The Warrens believed that the house was not only haunted by the spirits of the DeFeo family, but that it had become a vessel for demonic energy, drawn to the violence and suffering that had occurred there. It was as if the house had absorbed the bloodshed and darkness of the DeFeo murders, feeding the evil that had taken root within its walls. Ed and Lorraine Warren's investigation confirmed what they had feared. The house was not just a haunted place. It was a place of active demonic oppression, trying to drag the Lutz family into the abyss. The Lutz family, unable to withstand the growing terror any longer, fled the house after 28 days. They left everything behind. Their belongings, their hopes, and their dreams of a new life. They never returned. After their departure, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue remained a source of fascination and terror. The story of the Lutz's harrowing experience would go on to inspire books, movies, and documentaries. Despite the skepticism that surrounded their story, the Lutz family's experiences would leave a permanent mark on the world of the paranormal. Whether one believes in the supernatural or not, one thing remains clear: there was something deeply evil about that house. The house itself was eventually sold to new owners, who reported no paranormal activity during their time there. But the legend of the Amityville Horror has lived on, with the house standing as a chilling reminder of the darkness that once resided within its walls. Even as the years have passed, the story continues to captivate and horrify. The debate rages on. Was the Lutz family's experience real, or was it an elaborate hoax? No one will ever know for sure. But the legacy of the Amityville Horror endures, leaving the house forever haunted by its dark history.